goes there?
The Delapore Media Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Delapore Media Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Wall. This recording marks my 10th episode, and that feels like a big deal to me. I think the show is starting to find its voice. It's a Lovecraftian NPR-style affair where I bring you topics and literature that inspire my TTRPGs and writing, so you can be inspired in your own creative pursuits. I read cosmic horror works of today and yesterday. I talk about theory and history. I workshop ideas, and hopefully we all learn something along the way that makes us better, more informed creators of horror. My go-to creative space is role-playing games, but you're certain to find something to inspire you in every show, no matter what kind of horror you create. Have a listen, learn something new, get inspired, and if you like what you hear, take a moment to give us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, as that really helps a small podcast like this break through and grow its audience. So seeing as this is a milestone episode, I think we should tackle something foundational. A root trope that turns up in all manner of cosmic horror, good and bad. Let's talk about cults. Even though the great old ones, or whatever masters of cosmic horror you celebrate, are eternal, cults have transformed in the last century. The cults that HPL mirrored in his works were largely based on secret societies, and a lot of TTRPGs fall into the pattern of treating cultists as faceless killers with suicidal zeal. But this simple-minded evil portrayal is often unrealistic, and frankly, I think it borders on the cartoonish. Homicidal and suicidal zeal requires an explanation. Are the great old ones using dreams or brain parasites, or is there some sort of brainwashing at work? You could have magic as a sole solution, but there is proof that humans can be controlled and manipulated into fanatical behavior without a paranormal solution. And that means in a creative endeavor, you can add the paranormal to what's already going on with human behavior. And that means the supernatural horrors in your game or narrative can achieve an even tighter and more radical form of control that I think is way more fascinating than cobbling together a solution out of magic or sci-fi explanations on their own. While Lovecraft and his circle definitely had some resources to work with in terms of secret societies and how they worked, we really start to see inside the world of cults during what's termed the Fourth Great Awakening. Counted from the birth of Protestantism, the Fourth Great Awakening takes place in the 1960s. It's typified by mainline Protestant churches having a reduction in membership, the most conservative Protestant churches seeing an increase in membership, and a number of schisms and internecine conflicts. Evangelical and charismatic Christian churches rapidly expand at this time, and this is all in response to expanding secularism, and specifically in the United States, where a lot of this is taking place, there's also kind of a heavy distrust of institutions that's building, as we start to see movements fomented against ideas like racism and sexism, and also political actions like the Vietnam War. If you think about it, it's really more of a great upheaval as opposed to a great awakening. But definitely you have a part of the world where people are becoming more conscious of the divide between religion and spirituality, and they're all starting to question, well, what do we do about this? And into the gap come the cult leaders, a group of charismatic sociopaths peddling easy answers in exchange for devotion, adoration, sexual influence, violence, and all the money they can manage to grab in the process. Sometimes the dance is over quickly, and the cult leader is found out in a hurry, but sometimes it goes on for years and years. A long con that wraps around the cult leader and the followers, painting them into a corner until there's nowhere else to go. And then terrible things happen. Sometimes it's crimes, sometimes it's suicide. But ultimately there comes a point in every real-world example of a cult where the leader is found out, and their connection to God or the divine or everlasting salvation and paradise turns out to be faulty. But by then, the cult leader has been buying their own hype for so long, and the followers are so invested in that hype as well, that there's often no way out except tragedy. The text I've chosen to walk us through these cults of the Great Awakening is Amanda Montell's Cultish, the Language of Fanaticism. Montell is herself kind of an interesting figure in that she has crossed from very pop culture journalism, Time magazine, Glamour, Marie Claire, periodicals like that, over into feminism and the study of language. And her interest in cults specifically comes from her father's experience with the Synanon cult. Synanon, for those who are unfamiliar, was a cult-like organization that started in the 1950s in Southern California and passed itself off as a form of drug treatment in order to acquire more and more followers. Like a lot of cults, the situation ended rather badly. There were crimes committed, there were people threatened, and ultimately the leader was taken down and the cult compound and its antecedents were broken up, leaving people like Amanda Montell's father to kind of wonder, well, what do I do next? And how do I talk about what happened to me? Montell's focus is on language, and it is her strong supposition that there is no such thing as brainwashing. Brainwashing is not a technique that actually happens. It cannot be proven. You cannot hypnotize somebody into zealous cult-like behavior. But what you can do is talk to them, and you can change the way that they talk. And by doing that, you are able to love bomb them. You are able to set up a dichotomy where it's them against everybody else, and you are able to stop them from thinking outside the box with thought-terminating cliches. Now, this is actually kind of hard to replicate at the gaming table. I mean, if you think about it, you could do something like this in a piece of literature. You could have your cultists speak in kind of a peculiar way, or have them indoctrinated into a new form of speech. But putting that out at the gaming table is tricky. But there is an element of language that binds Lovecraftians and, well, many other fans of cosmic horror systems together. And that element of language is what HPL termed ACLO. Now, ACLO has its own kind of origins, its own definitions, but basically when I talk about ACLO, what I'm talking about is kind of that Cthulhu ipsum gobbledygook that Lovecraftians will supply as language from beings other than humans. And it has a way of binding us together as Lovecraftians and appreciators of cosmic horror, because we all know what Cthulhu Fhtagn means. And so we get a little bit of a taste of what it's like to have that cult language that separates you from the rest of society with the use of ACLO in stories and in media and games that we enjoy. But there's also ways of using ACLO within stories and games where the outwardly nonsensical language becomes a medium through which the mythos, the cosmic horror, is transferred. And I think the best example that I have ever seen, and what got me thinking about this, was Alan Moore's Neonomicon comic. If you'd never read it, it is a thing of beauty, it is a thing of horror, it is definitely not for the faint of heart, and comes with a fair share of trigger warnings that you can read up on yourself. But the opening chapter of that comic focuses on an FBI agent who is trying to track down what he thinks is a drug called ACLO. And he thinks this drug causes people to go mad and commit gruesome ritual murders. After tracking down a dealer at a club, the agent discovers ACLO is not a drug. It is a language. And when this language is given to users who are already in an altered state of consciousness, it allows them to access deep wells of symbolic thought that turns them into homicidal ritualists. So as I mentioned earlier, Montell identifies 3 linguistic strategies that cult leaders use to control their followers. And we're going to keep returning to these, so let's just get the definitions out of the way right now. The first is love bombing. Now, typically when we think about love bombing, when we've heard about it, it is the cult kind of showering new members with compliments. That's true in a sense, but what Montell in Cultish details is that love bombing is more about the cult and the cult leader providing understanding to new followers. New followers will come away from being love bombed feeling as though they've been listened to for the first time in their life, like someone is actually speaking to them, speaking their language, understands the world in the way that they do. That's really what love bombing is all about, according to Montell, and we'll dive into some examples of that shortly. The second thing that cult leaders do is they establish an us and them dichotomy. We're on the inside, everybody else is on the outside. And everybody else is jealous that we, and specifically you, are on the inside. And so you have to protect yourself, you have to protect the cult, you have to protect the cult leader. Because being on the inside means you have access to information, to knowledge, to power that these outsiders don't have, and they're all chomping at the bit to get it. That's why they don't like the cult. It is a twisting of reality to make cult followers see the world around them as enemies. And if you see the world outside you as composed entirely of enemies, well, then maybe the homicidal and suicidal zeal that the cultists of the pulps display isn't really all that far-fetched. Finally, there is the use of thought-terminating cliches. Now, I'll just kind of give you a list of them just to help you understand, because, it took me a while to really understand, well, what is a thought-terminating cliche? It is essentially a statement or maybe even a question that makes you stop thinking. It terminates the conversation. It ends any sort of disagreement. You can't disagree with the cult leader because they have terminated the conversation in such a way that disagreement is impossible. And you get these out in the wild, too. They're not just something you see in cults. You can see them in businesses. You can see them in families. You can see them in traditional religions as well. Statements like, "It is what it is." That's a thought-terminating cliche. So is "everything happens for a reason." Or even more political ones like "freedom isn't free." Or more dramatic and spiritually toned ones like, "well, those are lies of the devil." You can also get things that are more kind of contemporary, like "failure is not an option." Positive vibes only around here. And, a classic one that I know feminists love: "boys will be boys." So now let's look at 3 examples of cults that were built during the Fourth Great Awakening, and see how they utilize these linguistic strategies to gain and hold followers, as well as invest them with a kind of reality warping fanaticism. Example number 1, the People's Temple. If you don't know about the People's Temple by name, you probably know how it ended. Jonestown in Guyana. 909 cult members, including 304 children, were manipulated into an act that cult leader Jim Jones dubbed revolutionary suicide. Jones carried out this ghastly massacre after previously ordering his security team to kill a visiting U.S. congressman and his party as they attempted to depart the cult compound. The deaths were a gruesome turning point in the modern understanding of religious cults, and the event continues to cast a shadow over current events and fiction related to cults. So the tragedy of the Jonestown Massacre is a lot to unpack. Montell's book does a pretty good job of going over the details, and I highly recommend her interviews on the subject as she talks with survivors, lets them tell their story in their words. And at the same time, there are other great resources out there by investigators who have dedicated a lot of their lives to unpacking and understanding what led up to this tragedy. For my part, I want to focus more on what the People's Temple can teach us about cults, how they operate, and how they spread. So I'm going to look at some lessons that we can learn as creatives if we are attempting to put together a cult of our own in a game, in a narrative, and how does that cult operate, and how does it make sense within our narrative world. And we can use the People's Temple and a lot of the awful things that took place there as springboards into horror of our own. So the first lesson that I really picked up from reading Montell's retelling of the People's Temple story is that cults and similar organizations thrive on rebranding and confusion. And this is not something you see a lot in games or narratives, really. Cults typically have one name, they have kind of one identifier, they might have one symbol or a set of symbols that mark them as a particular entity, and that's for simplicity, sure. But it doesn't really reflect how cults, especially modern cults, use the confusion of rebranding. The People's Temple had several names: the Disciples of Christ, the Full Gospel Church, and Jim Jones had a variety of titles that he would periodically hide behind. The People's Temple was also a moving entity. It did not stay in one place for too long. It was founded in Indiana in the 1950s, very quickly made its way into Chicago, and then once the 60s hit, it made its way to Northern California and specifically San Francisco. The People's Temple concealed itself amongst other organizations of the wider progressive movement of the 60s. And this I found particularly interesting because we don't see that, again, repeated in games or in kind of pulp narratives about cults, the idea that these cults would conceal themselves amongst other organizations. In the 60s, San Francisco was flooded with progressive and radical groups, and the People's Temple was just one among many. And to outsiders, it was a church that practiced radical racial integration for its time, and Jones preached what he called apostolic socialism, basically preaching the tenets of socialism alongside more familiar gospel tenets. But as we will quickly see from this upcoming clip, those tenets changed dramatically as Jones began to influence more and more people and really began to, I guess in modern parlance, feel himself as a cult leader. Take a listen here.
This administration is for no other purpose.
That's right.
Than to show mankind the road to freedom. They're condescending saviors that come to us by their so-called pity from some judgment hall. But I'm here as a sample and example to show you that you can bring yourself up with your own bootstraps, and you can become your God, not in condescension, but in resurrection, in upliftment from whatever condition, economic injustice or servitude or racism you might have had to endure. Within you rest the keys of deliverance. Right. We ask for no condescending saviors. We want no help from some judgment hall. That has been pawned off on us too long. Now we're looking to the key that is within every heart and breast. And I, a God that came from the earth of earth, from the dust of this toilsome fields and the hardships of labor, from the lowest of economic positions, from the misery of poverty near the railroad tracks, I came to show you that the only God you need is within you.
Jim Jones was nothing if not a performer and a chameleon who could tailor his words to his particular audience. And he turned love bombing into an art form, and you heard some of it there in that, just a snippet from one of his many extended sermons. Jones would transform himself into the leader that an individual needed him to be. If they needed a Pentecostal preacher, well, you can see he was there. If they needed a revolutionary, he was there as well. A logical realist, a parent, a lover, he could do all of these things. This closeness also had a way of making Jones's attacks and barbs that much more cruel. When a person who perfectly understands you turns and insults you, there is no defense for that. And in a way, we can kind of gamify, if we like, using some familiar terms maybe from the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. We look at how Jones love bombs, and we might see that in terms of a manipulation spell or a domination spell. And then we might see how he turns and he can wound his own followers as kind of a method of cursing. He plants the seed, and from there he can wound his followers just as easily as he can get them to follow his instructions. And so Jones, again, in plain sight, billed himself as a preacher with a large church. But we hear it in there a very different kind of message, a message that, well, it actually kind of fits with those other two features of the linguistic strategy Montell talks about. You have the love bombing. I mean, Jones is an expert when it comes to that. But he's also using his love bombing speech, raising his people up as revolutionaries who can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, and he is dividing them against outsiders when he talks about kind of not needing a judgment or an administration beyond what the church has for them, what the People's Temple has for its followers. And you can also hear him offering thought-terminating cliches. I mean, at one point he says, God is within you, but then at another point he says, I am God, and that I am a God that has come from the same poverty that you all have, that I was born of the dust and I came from the wrong side of the railroad tracks. But what often happens with these cult leaders as they build up a following and they start feeling themselves is they start to stretch into uncomfortable places. They start to try and involve themselves and consume more and more of their followers' lives. I'm going to play a second clip of Jim Jones now. This one is decidedly more creepy. Once he had moved his cult's base of operations from San Francisco to Guyana and created Jonestown, Jones started doing these things he would call white knight events. Knight spelled N-I-G-H-T. And, people would wear white, and this is where there's some confusion over whether he kind of expected the revolutionary suicide thing to come ahead of time. Based on what I've read and based on what Montell says, that's not necessarily the case. It's more that he was constantly keeping his followers on edge. He was poking them, he was prodding them, he was saying, get up tonight, this evening, everybody dresses in white, it's a white night. We're going to circle around and talk about how our enemies are close to us and how things are going to come to an end soon. And this would be Jones's way of constantly stirring up stress and aggravation within the community that kept him on top. He was the only one who could keep a lid on top, and he had to make sure that he didn't have anybody who could inherit the community or take it away from him. And so this is, I'm not going to lie, a very weird, a very uncomfortable segment of speech on Jones's part, and it does go to some sexual places because, like all cult leaders, well, not all cult leaders, but like a lot of cult leaders, one way that Jim Jones liked to control his flock was through sex. And deciding who he had sex with, but also who could have sex with their partners and who would be partners for each other. Just reaching in and manipulating these intimate parts of his followers' lives that no person outside the cult would allow this kind of manipulation. But because these people were already on the inside and they had all these linguistic prompts working against them, they had the love bombing, they had the dichotomy of us and them, they had the thought-terminating cliches. Jim Jones could start to get away with saying a lot of weird and uncomfortable stuff. And this wouldn't be a study of his methods for creative inspiration if we didn't look at some of that uncomfortable stuff. So I'll just warn you right here. The clip is about 2 minutes and 15 seconds and includes the topics of sex and suicide.
When you see beauty, you're touched by it. And I don't know, but I'm probably called a freak, but I'm sexually moved by it. Because sex is life with me. I've gotten my sexual instincts on a higher level than most. Some people go around with their tight-fitting, forming clothes and try to get all the pimples out. You don't touch me. But warmth, character, you're irresistible. But what I want to do most is to hug you because sex seems to make the female very insecure anyway. If she gets good sex, it's insecure, whatever. It doesn't help you. So I want to hold people. I would like to hold all of you in my arms and so that you never have any more pain. Never have any more pain. Give you all the love I could give you and then be able to grant you eternal rest. But I don't think it works that way unless it's through principle. I believe basically, morally, revolutionary suicide is the only kind of thing justified. And I'm very much concerned for you that if you commit suicide or try to die any other way, doing your own selfish thing or whatever, you will come back. I don't care. Hell, I've been back 1,000,000 years. It seems like every day is a lifetime to me. What the hell's another life? I really don't mind anymore. You get to the point where you can take it or leave it, can't you? You get to the point where you can take it or leave it. Shit, it's just another day. But you in learning and build up such rebellion. I understand that rebellion. Remember, I'm in learning with you. I'm in the worst learning situation there is. I have to be good, I have to properly appear, I have to smile, I have to say the right thing, I have to do the right thing, and then by God I got to make the right decisions. Because everyone that I've healed in here, that will not be remembered. When one good person goes down, I'll be blamed. All over the place there'll be mumblings. There's mumblings now.
A portrait of a man who is in love with himself and very much buying into his own hype. But that is the kind of personality and ego it takes to lead a cult off the edge of a cliff. When we're thinking about our fictional cult leaders, they can't really be meek people, even in the event that they have some sort of supernatural attachment or something like that. It takes a very specific kind of personality to manipulate and harm people in this way. And so, personal opinion on my part, I think it's worth looking at and listening to some of these folks and what they actually said and did when it came to their real-life cults. Because often, at least as far as I'm concerned, there's enough horror in the world out there that we don't have to agonize about creating new paths of horror. We can just build on what exists in our world and what exists within our human experience and share it with others. While we're talking about Jim Jones, I'll just kind of end on maybe a bit of humor in that I don't know if it's just that hindsight is 20/20 or something like that, but my goodness, to see this man in person. If you have never seen a picture of what Jim Jones looks like, my own creative mind looks at this man with his smooth, deep voice, his black coiffure, his square jaw, his penchant for dark aviator sunglasses, and his magnetic presence that's just full of red flags. And I can't help but see a man who is consumed by the mythos. I mean, I wonder what horrors will leap out of his empty eye sockets if he takes those glasses off. It strikes me that this is one of those faces of evil, and probably because we know what he did, we can see him this way. But I definitely think from the perspective of learning and creating, he's worth having a gander at. If only that you can say that you did it and you decided, hey, I want to borrow this idea, I want to borrow this trope, or I want nothing to do with this, and I want my mythos cult leader to look nothing like this man. It's up to you. But like any kind of dark art, this man's many pictures, which are just available with an easy Google, are worth looking at for inspiration and telling your own stories. Now, as a final lesson of what we can take away from the People's Temple, I do want to return to the Jonestown Massacre, specifically the lead up to it. I'm not going to go into detail or anything, and my general recommendation is, only get as deep into the pool as you're really comfortable with this kind of stuff, because, learning about it does change you, and it does change your perspective on humankind, at least in my opinion. But there is this particular artifact that comes from the Jonestown Massacre, and it has been pored over and it has been studied, and you can find references on the internet if you look up Jonestown Death Tape. This is the name that has been given to the tape recording of Jim Jones's final sermon to his people, basically his sermon where he convinced them to take their own lives, and he convinced some of them to forcibly take the lives of their families, their children. And it stands out as a gruesome, a morbid artifact that has been of fascination to onlookers and insight for investigators into the People's Temple and into Jones himself and the mind of a cult leader. And I do not recommend listening to this tape unless you have the stomach for it, unless you feel as though you are mentally fortified to deal with this kind of tape and its contents. I would, however, say that as an artifact itself, it screams horror trope. I mean, analog horror is extremely popular at the moment, and the idea of a tape recording of a man convincing a bunch of people to die and kill their families in the process, that to me, it just feels like it has a lot of evil power. And I think as a trope, it could be moved into a fictional space discussing cults. And in some ways, I mean, I think you could go a couple of different ways with it. It could be a mythos tome. I mean, it definitely has the notoriety that makes it worthy of something like the Necronomicon, of at least being held up as something like the Necronomicon. Or it could be a haunted object containing the predatory shadows of the cult leader and their zealous flock. You could fictionalize this trope and use it as something to put in front of your players, use it as something to center a narrative around. I just feel like something like a cult's death tape is very definitely something that you could write a cosmic horror story around, either at a gaming table or in narrative format. And I think it's worth considering as we kind of consider going into the future, you know, what do the mythos tomes, what do the forbidden texts, the forbidden scrolls of our day and era look like? Now, I think about my audience for this particular podcast, and I can practically hear some of you saying, well, okay, Stephen, yes, the People's Temple, absolutely fascinating, but it is something from another era outside of where I like to play or where I like to write. Lovecraft was of a particular time, the 20s and 30s, and Jim Jones, I mean, from the beginning we know that he's from the Fourth Great Awakening. He's from the 60s and up into the 70s. So how do I square this? How does this relate to Lovecraft? And I would say that, once again, we're back at the notion that the Fourth Great Awakening, as much as cults were a new phenomenon there, cults had been around before that. The Fourth Great Awakening, we really kind of had some of these upset moments where we got to peek inside of a cult. And as we look inside the People's Temple, and we see the radical vision for the future that Jim Jones, despite his whims and eccentricities, he profligated and sold these followers, we can definitely see some parallels between the People's Temple and the Cthulhu cult. Both of these groups catered to downtrodden individuals. The People's Temple prided itself on radical racial integration for its day and age, and appealing to people who had nowhere else to turn, appealing to minority groups that were struggling under tremendous financial and social burdens because of racism. And Jim Jones sold them the lie that they could integrate into the People's Temple and have a better life, despite the fact, like many cult leaders, when you got to the inner circle of the People's Temple, it was one man surrounded by a bunch of white women who had traded their sexuality and their skin color for power within the People's Temple. And that is not necessarily even me saying that. That is Amanda Montell's argument related to the matter. In both cases, though, the Cthulhu cult and the People's Temple, both groups of downtrodden individuals sought a promised revolutionary utopia. The only real critical matter of difference was the nature of that utopia, what that utopia would look like. And as you say to yourselves, well, Stephen, the People's Temple wanted a socialist paradise, and the Cthulhu cult wanted to kill and shout in new and different ways that their alien gods would teach them. I encourage you to remember the words of Charles Thomas Tester, aka Black Tom, when Detective Malone questioned him on a similar train of thought. I'd choose Cthulhu over you devils any day. The Raid on the Swamp Cult. From The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legrasse's men as they plowed through the black morass toward the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men, and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear one when the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license here whipped themselves to demoniac heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Now and then the less organized ululation would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise a sing-song chant, that hideous phrase or ritual. Fanglui, Meglanafa, Cthulhu Rilye, Waganagul, Fatagan. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Legrasse dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting man, and all stood trembling and near hypnotized with horror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any but a Syme or an Angarola could paint. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous with its diminutiveness, rested the noxious carven statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals with the flame-girt monolith as their center, head downward, the oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right, in endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have only been imagination, and it may have only been echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far and unilluminated deeper spot within the wood of ancient legendry and horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings, and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a monstrous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in the throng, the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the nauseous rout. For 5 minutes, the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. But in the end, Legrasse was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and fall into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image on the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legrasse. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners proved to be men of very low mixed blood and mentally aberrant type. Most were seamen, and a sprinkling of Negroes and mulattoes, largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands. gave a coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than Negro fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first men, who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of R'lyeh under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writing now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chant only meant this: in his house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Only 2 prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged. The rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders, and averred that the killing had been done by black-winged ones, which had come to them from their immemorial meeting place in the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies no coherent account could ever be gained. What the police did extract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of theosophists, and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been aeons when other things had ruled on the earth, and they had had great cities. Remains of them, he said the deathless Chinaman had told him, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before men came, but there were arts which could revive them, when the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars, and brought their images with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not the star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of R'lyeh, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu, for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time, some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think, whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked in their tombs. When, after infinities of chaos, the first men came, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them, by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshy minds of mammals. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around small idols which the Great Ones had showed them. Idols brought in dim areas from dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of Earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams. But then something had happened. The great stone city Rillier, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves, and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and high priests said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldy and shadowy, and full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he thought the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Irem, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever hinted of it, though the deathless Chinaman said there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, which the initiated might read as they chose, especially the much-discussed couplet, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die." Example 2. Heaven's Gate. In March of 1997, 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult committed suicide believing they were leaving their earthly bodies and meeting an alien spacecraft concealed in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet. Heaven's Gate was a much smaller cult organization than Jonestown, occupying a large house in Rancho Santa Fe, California, as opposed to multiple churches or a town-sized compound. As such, the language utilized by Heaven's Gate was highly refined and specific to the group. Their beliefs and speech matched facets of Christian millennial apocalyptic belief, UFO subculture, and science fiction films and television, particularly Star Trek: The Next Generation. These individuals were so wound up in their own linguistic patterns they could not be understood by outsiders, and the leader of the group, Marshall Applewhite, used this language to directly control and isolate the group so much that he could warp reality, convincing them that he was an alien being wearing a human disguise, and they all needed to shed their bodily vehicles in order to be transported away from the dying Earth by a spaceship they took his word existed. Again, there are a lot of good resources out there, and researchers who have done a lot of serious work investigating the rise and fall of Heaven's Gate. For my part, what I want to do is look at Montell's assessment of Heaven's Gate and find the lessons that I can learn as someone who wants to write about cults and cult behavior. So originally, Heaven's Gate did not have a sole leader. That position was kind of thrust on Marshall Applewhite when his partner, Bonnie Nettles died of cancer in 1983. In many ways, Bonnie Nettles was the soul of the Heaven's Gate cult. She was the astrology reader, she was the sage, she was the one who was practicing the mystical rituals that were giving Heaven's Gate its direction and propping it up as something other than a fringe religious group, kind of lending it an aspect of paranormal authenticity. Meanwhile, Applewhite kind of ran the day-to-day affairs. And when Nettles died, Applewhite took that very hard, at least according to survivors of Heaven's Gate. And that's when things began to change dramatically in the cult, and the direction turned toward this kind of long-term plan of preparing for mass suicide. So the first lesson that we can come away with looking at the Heaven's Gate cult is that if a traumatic event happens to a cult leader, they can spiral and they can take the cult with them. When Applewhite's partner and fellow cult leader died, he set the cult on a course for self-destruction. This shows that cults react to the world around them, and I don't see why it should be any different in a TTRPG or fiction. Sure, your world might be steeped in the supernatural realities of the Cthulhu mythos, but that doesn't mean that people aren't people, and that doesn't mean that when a loved one dies, people don't feel grief. So if your investigators accidentally kill someone meaningful to the cult leader, this could put the cult into a state of zealous aggression and violence. With Applewhite, another thing that is worth exploring is his relationship to the strategy of separating us from them, separating the insiders of the cult from the outsiders of the world. Applewhite was particularly good at this, and he crafted his language around establishing this dichotomy and maintaining it at all times. He convinced his group of their uniqueness, of their singular purpose, and he did this by charging that the rest of the world was base and undeserving of the gifts that he would bestow to his followers. Everyone outside of the house was outside of the craft, as he called it, and they were somehow flawed and broken. And these bodies and souls who couldn't commit to Heaven's Gate the way that his followers could were doomed to be recycled along with the rest of the earth when it was plowed under by a millennial event. Here's an example of Applewhite arguing this dichotomy in a video that was intended for new inductees into the Heaven's Gate Fellowship.
Human flesh is of the lower forces, of the kingdom level beneath the kingdom of God, of the stepping stone that could lead to the kingdom of heaven. So flesh, or human flesh, now that isn't to put you down and to say you're all, if you're wearing a human vehicle. I'm wearing a human vehicle because I have to wear one for this task. I don't like it. It doesn't match me. And those who sit in front of me, they don't like their human vehicles that they have to wear for this task, but they have to wear them because the task of overcoming the human kingdom requires that they overcome flesh. The genetic vibrations, the lust of the flesh, the desire to reproduce, the desire to cling to offspring or spouse or parents or house or money or fame or job.
Though it is much more obviously weird at first glance compared to the People's Temple, which could just look like a radical church at a distance, Heaven's Gate was still utilizing its surroundings to blend in. And I think this is another lesson that we can pick up, is that even when our cults are weird and alien and maybe displaying elements of cosmic horror or the Cthulhu mythos, there is still room to absorb and utilize stylistic and linguistic culture that is happening around the cult. We see that Heaven's Gate did this with UFO conspiracy culture and with Trekkie aesthetics. To anyone paying attention close enough, Heaven's Gate would seem very strange and very much like a cult. But these people were capable of functioning in the real world. One way that Heaven's Gate managed to continue was to send its members out into the world to do day jobs. There were, for example, multiple members of Heaven's Gate that worked in the tech industry and in tech and computer support. I mean, these were people that were actively part of a cult that was planning a mass suicide and a mass exodus from the human condition, but they still managed to pay the bills and keep the lights on. And I think part of that is because they were using what was immediately around them to hide their nature, or at least to appear mundane enough that nobody was going to ask questions who didn't want to start something, who didn't want to cause trouble. Oh, those people are weird. Let's get on with our day. We have plenty of other errands to run. And from there, they managed to subsist and they managed to thrive even, all living together in a large house in Rancho Santa Fe, California that Marshall Applewhite called the craft, the ship. Finally, I think we can return to appearance one more time and point out that Marshall Applewhite has a very unique look and a very unique feel to him that I think we can lift portions of for our own creative endeavors. His piercing eyes, his short haircut that was mimicked by everyone around him, his degree of androgyny kind of coupled with this, I don't know how to put it, I mean, from where I sit, kind of an angry grandpa mentality as he was explaining away his doctrine to initiates. I think all of that has qualities that we can lift. I mean, and again, hindsight being 2020, we can obviously tell that there were a lot of red flags waving with this guy by looking at him. But that doesn't mean that we can't, grab a piece here or there, or maybe even merge some of Marshall Applewhite with Jim Jones and kind of create an amalgam figure, maybe somebody who wears like a Star Trek uniform, but has like a highly processed and maintained pompadour hairstyle and aviator sunglasses. I mean, I think that could tick some boxes and indicate, okay, this guy's weird, but maybe we don't immediately jump to Marshall Applewhite or Jim Jones by kind of merging them together. I think that taking these cues from these very dangerously eccentric individuals can give us some NPCs, some antagonists, some villains in a storyline who feel unique and weird, but are also real enough to kind of pass the sniff test because they're based on real people. So again, the question comes, how do we relate it back to Lovecraft? I mean, Marshall Applewhite and Heaven's Gate are a very modern millennial cult. They are not something that you would expect to see during Lovecraft's time, or they wouldn't be something that Lovecraft would represent in a story in any way. But then again, they might be. I mean, if we look at Enoch Bowen of The Haunter of the Dark and his Church of Starry Wisdom, a very eccentric group of people who were definitely looking into the stars and looking into strange high places in the hopes of finding truth, power, God, who's to say? And especially the way things kind of end with them, where they just seem to disappear all at once. As much as Marshall Applewhite and his crew are a unique and millennial construction, it kind of proves that these things just go in cycles, and the more things change, the more they stay the same. I'll show you what I mean. Robert Blake explores the Church of Starry Wisdom. From The Haunter of the Dark by H.P. Lovecraft. Once on the ground floor, Blake began exploring in a rapid fashion. All the inner doors were unlocked, so that he passed freely from room to room. The colossal nave was an almost eldritch place, with its drifts and mountains of dust over box pews, altar, hourglass pulpit, and sounding board, and its titanic ropes of cobwebs stretching among the pointed arches of the gallery and entwining the clustered Gothic columns. Over all this hushed desolation played a hideous leaden light, as the declining afternoon sun sent its rays through the strange, half-blackened panes of the great apsidal windows. The paintings on those windows were so obscured by soot that Blake could scarcely decipher what they had represented, but from the little he could make out, he did not like them. The designs were largely conventional, and his knowledge of obscure symbolism told him much concerning some of the ancient patterns. The few saints depicted bore expressions distinctly open to criticism, while one of the windows seemed to show merely a dark space with spirals of curious luminosity scattered about in it. Turning away from the windows, Blake noticed that the cobwebbed cross above the altar was not of the ordinary kind, but resembled the primordial Ankh, or crux ansata, of shadowy Egypt. In a rear vestry room beside the apse, Blake found a rotting desk and ceiling-high shelves of mildewed, disintegrating books. Here, for the first time, he received a positive shock of objective horror, for the titles of those books told him much. They were the black forbidden things which most sane people have never heard of, or have heard of only in furtive, timorous whispers. The banned and dreaded repositories of equivocal secrets and immemorial formulae, which have trickled down the stream of time from the days of man's youth and the dim, fabulous days before man was. He had himself read many of them, a Latin version of the abhorred Necronomicon, the sinister Liber Ivanus, the infamous Culte de Ghoul of Comte de Erlet, the unaussprechlichen Kulten of von Junst, and old Ludwig Prinz Hellish de Vermis Mysterious. But there were others he had known merely by reputation, or not at all. The Narcotic Manuscripts, the Book of Desian, and a crumbling volume in wholly unidentifiable characters, yet with certain symbols and diagrams shudderingly recognizable to the occult student. Clearly the lingering local rumors had not lied. This place had once been the seat of an evil older than mankind, and wider than the known universe. In the ruined desk was a small leather-bound record book filled with entries in some old cryptographic medium. The manuscript writing consisted of the common traditional symbols used today in astronomy and anciently in alchemy, astrology, and other dubious arts. The devices of the sun, moon, planets, aspects, and zodiacal signs, here massed in solid pages of text with divisions and paragraphings suggesting that each symbol answered to some alphabetical letter. In the hope of later solving the cryptogram, Blake bore off this volume in his coat pocket. Many of the great tomes on the shelves fascinated him unutterably, and he felt tempted to borrow them at some later time. He wondered how they could have remained undisturbed so long. Was he the first to conquer the clutching, pervasive fear that had for nearly 60 years protected this deserted place from visitors? Having now thoroughly explored the ground floor, Blake plowed again through the dust of the spectral nave to the front of the vestibule, where he had seen a door and staircase presumably leading up to the blackened tower and steeple, objects so long familiar to him at a distance. The ascent was a choking experience, for dust lay thick while the spiders had done their worst in this constricted place. The staircase was a spiral with high, narrow wooden treads. And now and then Blake passed a clouded window looking dizzily out over the city. Though he had seen no ropes below, he expected to find a bell or peal of bells in the tower whose narrow, louver-boarded lancet his field glass had studied so often. Here he was doomed to disappointment, for when he attained the top of the stairs he found the tower chamber vacant of chimes, and clearly devoted to vastly different purposes. The room, about 15 feet square, was faintly lighted by 4 lancet windows, one on each side, which were glazed within their screening of decayed louver boards. These had been further fitted with tight, opaque screens, but the latter were now largely rotted away. In the center of the dust-laden floor rose a curiously angled stone pillar, some 4 feet in height and 2 in average diameter, covered on each side with bizarre, crudely incised, and wholly unrecognizable hieroglyphs. On this pillar rested a metal box of peculiarly asymmetrical form, its hinged lid thrown back, and its interior holding what looked beneath the decade-deep dust to be an egg-shaped or irregularly spherical object some 4 inches through. Around the pillar in a rough circle were 7 high-backed Gothic chairs still largely intact, while behind them, ranging along the dark-paneled walls, were 7 colossal images of crumbling, black-painted plaster, resembling more than anything else the cryptic carven megaliths of mysterious Easter Island. In one corner of the cobwebbed chamber a ladder was built into the wall, leading up to the closed trap door of the windowless steeple above. As Blake grew accustomed to the feeble light, he noticed odd bas-reliefs on the strange open box of yellowish metal. Approaching, he tried to clear the dust away with his hands and handkerchief, and saw that the figures were of a monstrous and utterly alien kind, depicting entities which, though seemingly alive, resembled no life form ever evolved on this planet. The 4-inch seeming sphere turned out to be a nearly black, red-striated polyhedron, with many irregular flat surfaces, either a very remarkable crystal of some sort, or an artificial object of carved and highly polished mineral matter. It did not touch the bottom of the box, but was held suspended by means of a metal band around its center, with 7 queerly designed supports extending horizontally to angles of the box's inner wall near the top. This stone, once exposed, exerted upon Blake an almost alarming fascination. He could scarcely tear his eyes from it, and as he looked at its glistening surfaces he almost fancied it was transparent, with half-formed worlds of wonder within. Into his mind floated pictures of alien orbs with great stone towers, and other orbs with Titan mountains and no mark of life, and still remoter spaces where only stirring and vague blackness told of the presence of consciousness and will. When he did look away, it was to notice a somewhat singular mound of dust in the far corner, near the ladder to the steeple. Just why it took his attention he could not tell, but something in its contours carried a message to his unconscious mind. Plowing toward it and brushing aside the hanging cobwebs as he went, he began to discern something grim about it. Hand and handkerchief soon revealed the truth, and Blake gasped with a baffling mixture of emotions. It was a human skeleton, and it must have been there for a very long time. The clothing was in shreds, but some buttons and fragments of cloth bespoke a man's gray suit. There were other bits of evidence: shoes, metal clasps, huge buttons for round cuffs, a stick pin of bygone pattern, a reporter's badge with the name of the old Providence telegram, and a crumbling leather pocketbook. Blake examined the latter with care, finding within it several bills of antique issue, a celluloid advertising calendar from 1893, some cards with the name Edwin M. Lillibridge, and a paper covered in penciled memoranda. This paper held much of a puzzling nature, and Blake read it carefully at the dim westward window. Its disjointed text included such phrases as the following. Professor Enoch Bowen, home from Egypt, May 1844, buys Old Free Will Church in July, his archaeological work and studies in occult well known. Dr. Drown of Fourth Baptist warns against starry wisdom in sermon December 29, 1844. Congregation 97 by end of 45. 1846, 3 disappearances, first mention of shining trapezohedron. 7 disappearances, 1848, stories of blood sacrifice begin. Father O'Malley tells of devil worship with box found in great Egyptian ruins. Says they call up something that can't exist in light. Flees a little light, and banished by strong light. Then has to be summoned again. Probably got this from deathbed confession of Francis Xavier Feeney, who had joined Starry Wisdom in 49. These people say shining trapezohedron shows them heaven and other worlds, and the Haunter of the Dark tells them secrets in some way. Story of Orrin B. Eddy, 1857. They call it up by gazing at the crystal, and have a secret language of their own. 200 or more in congregation, 1863, exclusive of men at front. Irish boys mob church in 1869 after Patrick Reagan's disappearance. Veiled article in journal, March 14, 72, but people don't talk about it. 6 disappearances in 1876. A secret committee calls on Mayor Doyle. Action promised February 1877. Church closes in April. Gang, Federal Hill Boys, threaten doctor and vestryman in May. 181 persons leave city before end of 77. Mention no names. Ghost stories begin in 1880. Try to ascertain truth of report that no human being has entered church since 1877. Ask Lanigan for photograph of place taken in 1851. Example 3. Scientology. The origins of Scientology are strange and complex even by the standards of cults. The founder of the cult, science fiction author L. Ron Hubbard, is probably the most successful example of a cult leader. Joseph Smith of the Mormon Church of Latter-day Saints might have had a more successful legacy, but L. Ron Hubbard actually lived to see a great deal of success and enjoy the profits of his scam. Curiously enough, he actually started out writing westerns and science fiction for the pulps, just like Lovecraft. Actually, not long after Lovecraft's career came to an end, L. Ron Hubbard was producing stories for magazines like Astounding and Unknown. There's definitely some irony to Hubbard and Lovecraft having parallel career tracks in the pulps, although definitely they were very, very different men. In that I don't think HPL really thought that much of himself, where Hubbard was a self-aggrandizer par excellence. I mean, you want to talk about a man who was in love with himself. This guy had a church with 25,000 members internationally, and he forced them to produce, endure, and purchase his music.
Thank you for listening.
Nope, not today, Elron. For further information on the career, antics, and crimes of L. Ron Hubbard, I strongly recommend the half-dozen thoroughly researched and entertaining episodes of the Behind the Bastards podcast dedicated to him. I mean, if you want a primer on what L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology are all about, you can't really go wrong with that podcast. And on top of that, they have way better lawyers than I do. So once again, we're going to look at the lessons that we can pick up from Scientology. And where other cults, I mean, if we think like the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate, that there was definitely some sort of underlying belief structure there. Scientology is far more easily seen as a scam. It maintains a scam-like structure, funneling money and information upwards into a hierarchy while pretending to be a helpful alternative to things like psychology and psychiatry. It exposes a lot of the games that cults play while playing them better than most. And it has enough monetary weight to throw around that it can take on the appearance of a real quote-unquote church. A cult like Scientology is large and opulent enough that a secondary mythos cult could hide inside of it. I mean, the thing is, there are so many branches, so many elements of Scientology that people can get away with things. People can go to places where the leadership isn't looking. And so you could easily have a scam cult in your tabletop role-playing world or in your narrative and conceal a mythos element within it, either at its core or out in some far-off corner. Scientology practices its own forms of love bombing and creating an us-them dichotomy. But where I really think it excels is in the thought-terminating cliché. There are layers upon layers of exhaustive work in Scientology, class after class, level after level. Participants are encouraged to shell out thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to achieve the enlightenment that Scientology offers. And it comes from a place where the work to be done is unquestionable. As an ex-Scientologist who escaped the church tells Amanda Montell in the book Cultish, L. Ron Hubbard's tech, meaning his philosophies, his classes, the levels that you achieve in Scientology, is flawless. If you have a problem with the tech, the problem is with you, not the program, because the program is perfect. The program leads to a better, purer state of being. And if you paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to achieve that better, purer state of being, and you didn't get there, well, that's just your problem. That's something within you that is blocking or stopping the tech from doing its job. Scientology makes very clear from its beginning personality tests that it offers on the street for free to passers-by who are unaware of what they're stepping into, that you as a human being are flawed. Now, pointing out that you're imperfect and kind of mashing the buttons on your flaws is something that most cults participate in one way or another. To give another example, Montell's father was involved in Synanon. Synanon had a construction, an event that took place on a nightly basis called The Game. In The Game, individual members of the cult would form small groups and take turns berating one another. And the rule of the game was that you had to sit there and take it. You had to endure whatever verbal abuse was thrown at you. But of course, that verbal abuse isn't just going to wash over you. I mean, especially when more and more people pile on to you. If anything, it's going to do kind of the opposite of love bombing. It's going to make you seem small. It's going to make you feel your flaws and feel useless and feel isolated and need the cult, need the group more and more. Remember back when we were discussing Jim Jones and the idea that if you love bomb somebody and then insult them, your insults, your barbs are going to hit that much harder. This is another practice of Scientology. They call it auditing, and they utilize a device called an e-meter, which, when approached on the subject, the cult readily admits that the e-meter does nothing. It merely facilitates a spiritual process of having the auditor register and comprehend the emotions of the individual being audited. And I mean, effectively auditing, as different investigators have figured out over time, is really more a process of kind of sifting through everybody's dirty laundry to look for secrets that can be held against them should they try and depart the cult or not pay for the next level. A fun fact from my family history, my mother has always stated that she received an early personality test from Dianetics officials back in the day when things were just getting started for the Church of Scientology. And she knew it was phony the moment that they brought out a pair of tin cans with alligator clips on them to read her emotional responses. So one more time, let's see if our example cult can be related back to Lovecraft. And in this case, I think we have to turn to esteemed Innsmouth storyteller Zadok Allen to recount for us the first days of the Esoteric Order of Dagon, and how Obed Marsh, upon being freed from jail, locked down the town and transformed it, giving it a new system of governance and new religious rites to go with that. It was for the good of the town and the survival of the people of Innsmouth that Obed made his particular deal with the Deep Ones. And in some ways that's kind of similar to how L. Ron Hubbard and the leaders of Scientology would frame their requests to lower-ranking members when they asked them to perjure themselves or commit other illegal acts. It was always about doing the right thing for the church and for the people of the church, the best and highest good for the most number of people. And just like Obed and those that followed him, the leadership of Scientology sold this pack of lies to its followers and transformed them in their own way by cutting them off from the rest of society, by giving them a language to speak that made them incompatible with the rest of humanity. Zadok Allen tells a story to Robert Olmsted from The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. Then's the time Obed he began a cursin' at the folks for being dull sheep and prayin' to a Christian heaven as didn't help 'em none. He told 'em he knowed of folks as prayed to gods that give something ye really need, and says if a good bunch o' men unstand by him, he could maybe get a hold o' certain powers as 'ud bring plenty o' fish and quite a bit o' gold. O' course, them as served on the Sumatra Queen and seed the island knowed what he meant, and wasn't none too anxious to get close to see things like they'd heard tell on. But them as didn't know what 'twas all about got kinda swayed by what Obed had to say, and begun to ask him what he could do to set 'em on the way to the faith as'd bring 'em results. Here the old man faltered, mumbled, and lapsed into a moody and apprehensive silence, glancing nervously over his shoulder, and then turning back to stare fascinatedly at the distant black reef. When I spoke to him, he did not answer, so I knew I would have to let him finish the bottle. The insane yarn I was hearing interested me profoundly, for I fancied there was contained within it a sort of crude allegory based upon the strangeness of Innsmouth, and elaborated by an imagination at once creative and full of scraps of exotic legend. Not for a moment did I believe that the tale had any real substantial foundation. but nonetheless the account held a hint of genuine terror, if only because it brought in references to strange jewels clearly akin to the malign tiara I had seen at Newburyport. Perhaps the ornaments had, after all, come from a strange land, and possibly the wild stories were lies of the bygone Obed himself rather than of this antique toper. I handed Zadok the bottle, and he drained it to the last drop. It was curious how he could stand so much whiskey. He licked the nose of the bottle and slipped it into his pocket, then beginning to nod and whisper softly to himself. I bent close to catch any articulate words he might utter, and thought I saw a sardonic smile behind the stained, bushy whiskers. Yes, he was really forming words, and I could grasp a fair portion of them. Poor Matt. Matt he allus was agin it. Tried to line up the folks on his side, and had long talks with the preachers. No use. They run the congregational parson out of town, and the Methodist feller quit. Never did see Resolve Babcock, the Baptist parson, again. Wrath of Jehovah. I was a mighty little critter, but I heard what I heard, and I seen what I seen. Dagon and Ashtoreth, Belial and Beelzebub, golden calf and the idols of Canaan, and the Philistines, Babylonish abominations. Mene, tekele, a parson. He stopped again, and from the look in his watery blue eyes, I feared he was close to a stupor after all. But when I gently shook his shoulder, he turned on me with an astonishing alertness, and snapped out some more obscure phrases. Don't believe me, eh? Then just tell me, young feller, why Captain Obed and 20-odd other folks used to row out to Devil Reef in the dead of night and chant things so loud you could hear 'em all over town when the wind was right. Tell me that, eh? And tell me why Obed was allus dropping heavy things down into the deep water to other side of the reef, where the bottom shoots down like a cliff lower than ye can sound. Tell me what he done with that funny-shaped lead thingamajig as Wallachia gave him. Eh, boy? And what did they all howl on May Eve and again the next Halloween? And why'd the new church parsons, fellers as used to be sailors, wear them queer robes and cover theirselves with them gold things Obed brung, eh? The watery blue eyes were almost savage and maniacal now, and the dirty white beard bristled electrically. Old Zadok probably saw me shrink back, for he had begun to cackle evilly. Beginning to see, eh? Maybe you'd like to been me in them days, when I seed things at night out to sea from the cupola top my house. Oh, I can tell ye, little pitchers have big ears, and I wouldn't missin' nothin' o' what was gossiped about Captain Obed and the folks out to the reef. How about the night I took my pa's ship's glass up to the cupola and seed the reef a-bristlin' thick with shapes that dove off quick soon as the moon's riz. Obed and the folks was in a dory, but them shapes dove off the far side into the deep water and never come up. How'd you like to be a little shaver alone in the cupola, a-watchin' shapes wasn't human shapes, eh? The old man was getting hysterical, and I began to shiver with nameless alarm. He laid a gnarled claw on my shoulder, and it seemed to me that its shaking was not altogether that of mirth. S'pose one night you seed something heavy heaved off Obed's dory beyond the reef, and then learned next day a young feller was missin' from home, eh? Did anyone ever see hide nor hair of Hiram Gilman again? Did they? And Nick Pierce? And Lully Waite? And Adoniram Southwick? And Henry Garrison? Eh? Shapes talking sign language with their hands. Them as had real hands. Well, sir, that was the time Obed began to get on his feet again. Folks see his 3 daughters a-wearing gold-like things, as nobody'd never seen on 'em afore. And smoke started coming out of the refinery chimbley. Other folks were prosperin' too. fish begun to swarm into the harbor, fit to kill. And heaven knows what sized cargoes we begun to ship out to Newburyport, Arkham, and Boston. 'Twas then Obed got the Old Branch Railroad put through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the catch and come up in sloops, but they was all lost. Nobody never seen him again, and just then our folks organized the Esoteric Order of Dagon and bought the Masonic Hall off in Calvary Commandery for it. Matt Elliott was a Mason and again the sellin', but he dropped out of sight just then. Remember, I ain't saying Obed was set on having things just like they was on that Kanaki Isle. I done think he aimed at first to do no mixin', no raise no young'uns to take to the water and turn into fishes with eternal life. He wanted them gold things, and was willing to pay heavy, and I guess the others was satisfied for a while. Come in 46, the town done some lookin' and thinkin' for itself. Too many folks missin', too much wild preachin' at meetin' of a Sunday, too much talk about that reef. I guess I done a bit of tellin' Selectman Mowry what I see from the cupola. There was a party one night as followed Obed's crowd out to the reef, and I heard shots betwixt the dories. Next day, Obed and 32 others was in jail, with everybody a-wonderin' just what was afoot, and just what charge agin 'em could be got to hold. God, if anybody'd looked ahead. A couple of weeks later, when nothing had been throwed into the sea for that long, Zadok showed signs of fright and exhaustion, and I let him keep silence for a while, though glancing apprehensively at my watch. The tide had turned and was coming in now, and the sound of the waves seemed to arouse him. I was glad of that tide, for at high water the fishy smell might not be so bad. Again I strained to catch his whispers. That awful night. I seed 'em. I was up in the cupola. Hordes of 'em, swarms of 'em, all over the reef and swimming up the harbor into the Monoxet. God, what happened in the streets of Innsmouth that night? They rattled our door, but Pa wouldn't open. Then he clumb out the kitchen window with his musket to find Selectman Mowry and see what he could do. Mounds of the dead and the dyin', shots and screams, shoutin' in Old Square and Town Square and New Church Green. Jail throwed open. Proclamation. Treason. Called it the plague when folks come in and found half our people missin'. Nobody left but them as 'ud jine in with Obed and them things or else keep quiet. Never heard of my pa no more. The old man was panting and perspiring profusely. His grip on my shoulder tightened. Everything cleaned up in the morning, but they was traces. Obed, he kinder takes charge and says things is going to be changed. Others'll worship with us at meetin' time, and certain houses has got to entertain guests. They wanted to mix like they done with the Kanakis, and he, for one, didn't feel bound to stop 'em. Far gone was Obed, just like a crazy man on the subject. He says they brung us fish and treasure and should have what they hankered arter. Nothing was to be different on the outside, only we was to keep shy of strangers if we knowed what was good for us. We all had to take the oath of Dagon, and later on they was second and third oaths that some on us took. Them as it helped special would get special rewards, gold and such. No use balkin', for they was millions of 'em down there. They'd rather not start rising up and wiping out humankind, but if they was gave away and forced to, they could do a lot towards just that. We didn't have them old charms to cut 'em off like the folks in the South Sea did. And them Kanakis wouldn't never give away their secrets. Yield up enough sacrifices and savage knickknacks and harborage in the town when they wanted it, and they'd let well enough alone. Wouldn't bother no strangers as might bear tales outside. That is, without they got pryin'. All in the band of the faithful. Order of Dagon and the children should never die, but go back to the Mother Hydra and Father Dagon, what we all come from once. Cthulhu Fatagan. Funglui, Meglanafa, Cthulhu Rilye, Waganakal, Fathagen. I won't lie in that I do feel very vulnerable presenting this particular piece to you. It was probably the most difficult piece of voice acting I've done to date, and I'm no voice actor. I even removed a couple of lines from the original Lovecraft piece describing Zadok's voice because I feel like my dockside drunkard is incompatible with Lovecraft's description. I only hope that the meaning of this particular portion of The Shadow over Innsmouth came through to you in my performance, and I didn't just sound like the pirate captain who opens every episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. So as we conclude our comparison of Lovecraftian and cosmic horror cults to their real-world analogs, I think it's important to end on the biggest difference between these two collections of groups. Real-world cults are undermining the truth of reality to mess with followers' emotions, to manipulate them into abandoning outside connections, giving away their time, their labor, their personal wealth, and coercing them into sexual exploitation, violence, and criminal acts on their behalf. But in a world of Lovecraftian horror or your cosmic horror of choice, the cult undermines the truth of reality because reality is a lie. In our fictional worlds of games and narrative, there is magic that can be tapped by human beings working in concert toward a particular goal. There are gods that can talk through prophets. There are aliens hiding behind comets that can hear the chantings and signals of the naked apes of planet Earth. But at the same time, the human factor is still in play, even in a fictional setting. And it shouldn't be ignored, as cults are not going to get the complete truth in most cases. The worshippers of Cthulhu might have an awareness of Cthulhu and the deep ones, and maybe even the notion that there are other entities out there. But it's unlikely that they are completely aware of the full pantheon of outer gods, and are just as familiar with Nyarlathotep and Azathoth as they might be with their chosen deities with which they are close. So if you're going to write a realistic cult into a game, into a narrative, or any other creative project involving cosmic horror, you need to take into account the human factor. And I hope what I've demonstrated here is that the cult followers and cult leaders of our games and fiction and other creative pursuits don't have to be one-dimensional, that there's actually a great variety of drive and complex purpose that can lead a person into a state of zealous fanaticism. And that zealous fanaticism doesn't always have to come from an alien place, from a supernatural place. We're perfectly capable of creating it right here at home. This has been Stephen Wall for Delapore Media. Keep thinking evil thoughts. Thank you for listening to the Delapore Media Podcast. You can find a variety of horror gaming resources at www.delapore.media. That's Delapore spelled Delapore. Delapore Media, toward verisimilitude in tabletop roleplay. Take care. Are you ready, kids?
Aye, Zadok.
I can't hear you.
Aye, Zadok.
Oh, who lives in a city beneath Devil's Reef?
Father Dagon.
A colossal Batrachian horror is he.
Father Dagon.
If life everlasting be something ye wish,
Father Dagon.
you'll slowly transform and look like a fish.
Father Dagon.
Chant it with me, kids.
Father Dagon. Father Dagon. Father Dagon.
Now where's me whiskey bottle? This podcast is a production of the Delapore Media sole proprietorship. Its contents may not be used for AI training. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved.